Opening the center's diagonal immediately challenges black to react, potentially opening lines for both kings. Opening the center for immediate king's-pawn conflict, a classic response asserting equality. Developing a knight to the center immediately contests black's pawn and prepares for castling, building a strong foundation. Developing a knight to defend the central pawn sets up a common and solid opening structure, preparing for further piece activity. This bishop, now eyeing the weakened f7 square, initiates a rapid development that can lead to sharp attacking chances. Developing the bishop to an active diagonal creates immediate counterpressure and mirrors white's initiative. Building central control and preparing d4, this pawn push subtly supports a queenside expansion. Developing the knight further challenges white's central pawn and opens lines for potential counterplay. Bolstering the e4 pawn while preparing for a more flexible development of the queenside pieces, aiming for solid central control. Solidifying the pawn chain and preparing for a potential kingside pawn push, 5. d6 asserts black's control over key central squares. Shifting the bishop from its attacking post creates a subtle, long-term diagonal threat, reinforcing central control for white. Securing the monarch away from the center's potential storm allows for flexible development of remaining pieces. Securing the king's safety with castling often opens avenues for piece development and central pressure. Reinforcing the kingside and preparing for a central pawn push, this move subtly aims to unbalance white's solid development. Bolstering the center and preparing a kingside knight redeployment, a subtle yet purposeful repositioning. Securing the queenside pawn structure establishes a subtle foothold, potentially preparing for a queenside expansion later. Sharpening the kingside defense by preventing a swift bishop sortie to g4 or h5. Retreating the bishop to a7 aims to exchange it for white's dark-squared bishop, potentially weakening white's kingside pawn structure. Recentralizing the rook on the open e-file initiates a gradual build-up, preparing to challenge black's solid pawn structure and create long-term pressure. Liberating the knight to a potentially aggressive outpost, though it might become a target. Opening the center demands immediate calculation, as it forces a confrontation of pieces. Exchanging the bishop clears the d-file, potentially opening lines for white's rook, and creating a pawn weakness on b2. Reclaiming the central pawn structure and opening a clear diagonal for the queen is a sound positional step. Unleashing the queen to challenge the d4 pawn creates immediate central pressure and opens lines for future attack. Solidifying the kingside pawn structure with g3 prevents potential knight infiltrations and prepares for a future kingside advance, creating a defensive barrier. Positioning the rook on the open e-file aims to challenge white's central control and prepare for potential future action. Securing the king's escape route while preparing to contest the central files offers better royal safety. Retreating the queen to d8 suggests black is assessing pawn structure weaknesses and seeking a less exposed central post. Unlocking the kingside attack requires better knight placement, but this move overlooks that immediate opportunity. Exchanges are imminent, potentially opening lines for white's rook or simplifying into a position where black's knight must make a strategic decision. Liberating the d-file opens a central path, forcing black to consider pawn structure and king safety. Reclaiming central space with the pawn is a logical response, solidifying black's pawn structure and opening the d-file for potential future activity. Simplifying the position, white initiates a queen trade, aiming to exploit the upcoming endgame with a slightly better structure. Reactivating the rook to the central file immediately re-establishes black's piece activity and prepares for potential central action. Stripping away pieces now simplifies the position, creating an endgame where king activity will be paramount. Reconstructing your pawn structure after the exchange creates weaknesses around your king. A knight suddenly ventures to the kingside, probing for weaknesses and aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure around the vulnerable king. Reclaiming the open d-file now offers better defensive and offensive chances, then leaving the rook passive. Initiating pressure along the open file, this rook now aims to exploit the vulnerable d-pawn and the king's slightly exposed position. Reinforcing the central d-file and preparing for potential pawn structure shifts, this redeployment skillfully addresses the immediate tactical threats. Trading rooks now solidifies white's central pawn structure and prepares for a more active knight. Opening the central files offers attacking potential, but also exposes your king slightly. Venturing the king forward initiates a risky endgame maneuver, aiming to activate its defensive potential amidst the exchanged pieces. Regrouping the bishop to the flank prepares for potential central pawn advances and better piece coordination. Shifting the king to the center signals a pragmatic transition, prioritizing king safety and potential central activity in the upcoming exchanges. Shifting the king offers a safe haven, preparing for potential pawn advances or rook activity on the open files. Securing the central file now prepares for a potential kingside pawn storm and gains influence over key squares. Reclaiming central influence, the knight now eyes the weak squares on white's kingside, hinting at a potential regrouping. Positioning the knight centrally opens the path for the other pieces to regroup and contest the open files. Consolidating the pawn structure opens pathways for the knight's active repositioning. Knight repositions to a more active central square, aiming to exert pressure on black's slightly uncoordinated pieces. Re-establishing the bishop's pressure on the queen side, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure. Attempting to seize space on the queen side, this pawn push aims to restrict black's maneuvers and potentially prepare a queenside expansion. Challenging white's pawn chain, this move injects dynamism by opening lines for black's pieces. Reclaiming the central square offers a flexible platform for piece repositioning. Repositioning the bishop to this square prepares for a potential pawn push on the queen side, aiming to unravel black's cramped position. Re-establishing pressure on the king side, preparing a pawn advance. Repositioning the knight to c8 aims to reinforce the queen side and potentially prepare for a central pawn break. Securing the queen's rook on the open file aims to create early pressure and control. Repositioning the rook to contest the open file signals a clear intention to improve its piece activity. Repositioning the knight to e1 aims to eventually bring it to the king side, perhaps via g2, to support a potential pawn push or create attacking chances. This maneuver seeks to activate the knight and challenge white's centralized piece, potentially preparing for pawn advances on the queen side. Repositioning the knight to a more active central square prepares for potential breakthroughs and pawn structure adjustments. Solidifying the queenside pawn structure aims to prevent white's knight infiltration and create potential for queenside expansion. Expanding aggressively on the kingside creates imbalances and potential weaknesses, but also seeks to restrict black's mobility. Saddling the knight on c4 creates an inviting target for white's pawn push and invites a positional setback. Liberating the knight opens avenues for piece activity, aiming to exploit black's slightly passive pawn structure. Capturing the pawn opens the b-file, potentially creating dynamic play and challenging white's pawn structure. Repositioning the knight to a more active square opens avenues for pawn breakthroughs. Reoccupying the bishop's former outpost strengthens black's blockade against white's queenside expansion. Consolidating the knight to a more centralized square enhances its influence over the queenside pawn structure. This pawn advances, aiming to disrupt white's knight activity and potentially open a file for the rook. Controlling the file opens up infiltration possibilities against black's weakened queenside pawn structure. This retreat aims to regroup and support the rook, preparing for a potential pawn push while securing the file for future operations. Redirecting knight to a more active outpost on d2 could prepare for a potential pawn advance or better piece coordination. The rook's repositioning to the third rank aims to disrupt white's queenside structure and potentially target weak pawns. Seizing the open c-file offers a chance to penetrate black's weakened queenside structure. sacrificing a pawn to create an active piece and potentially open lines against white's king, a risky but dynamic attempt. Capturing the pawn on a5 opens lines for white's rook, aiming to exploit black's slightly passive piece placement. Unleashing the rook on the 7th rank, this move initiates a potent mating threat on the exposed king. Centering the monarch offers a more robust defensive posture, preparing to contest central squares. Sacrificing material for queenside activity is a desperate gamble, hoping to tie down white's pawns and create counterplay. Securing the c6 pawn drastically improves white's pawn structure and opens up attacking possibilities. Reclaiming the vital d-file now becomes paramount for black's surviving pieces. This pawn push aggressively grabs space and aims to crack open the queenside. Sacrificing the rook here, black aims to disrupt white's attacking structure and open lines for counterplay. Targeting the advanced pawn's weakness on c4, preparing to exploit open files.